Misinformation and fake news are on the rise as the war between Israel and Hamas escalates, and tech firms are struggling to contain the flood of misinformation around Palestinian and Israeli hostilities. Researchers say the scale and speed of misinformation was spread online following Hamas's assault on Israel was unlike ever before. The conflict is casting a harsh light on the ability of prominent platforms to combat false information. Few instances of misinformation being disseminated, video game footage being passed off as a scene from a Hamas attack, an image circulating online purported to show Israeli soldiers captured by Hamas was actually from a military exercise in Gaza back in 2022. And several posts on X, Facebook, and TikTok promoted a fake White House document allocating $8 billion in military assistance to Israel. All sorts of things. Well, reports say that Elon Musk's platform X, formerly known as Twitter, appears to have the worst outbreak of fake news related to the war. The European Union is urging Mr. Musk to tackle the spread of disinformation. For more insight, we are joined by Dr. Olga Boychuk, live from Sydney, Australia. She's a lecturer in digital cultures, discipline of media and communications at the University of Sydney. Well, hello there, Dr. Boychuk. The EU's issued Elon Musk a stern warning, and of course, failure to comply with the regulations allowing around illegal content could result in huge fines for his company. He has remained actually very quiet, not responding. What do you foresee happening at his camp right now?
Hello, Yasmin. Thank you so much for having me. So indeed, since Elon Musk acquired Twitter, which is now known as X, in October 2022, last year, he has made many systemic and large-scale changes to how that platform is run. And as a result, many of us, those of us who are observing public discourse, the quality of public discourse on the platform, we could see the quality of it declining. We link it to the absence of moderation. As we know, content moderation is an extremely difficult task, and it's really much harder than just fact-checking. It has to do with the communities and strategic actors spreading this disinformation. And as a result, reducing funding, firing people who were responsible for content moderation on Twitter, now X, has really resulted in the kind of environment that we're seeing today. And that, of course, opens many avenues for disinformation. So we can. It's not just the nefarious actors being on the platform. It is the nature of photographic imagery and video as a moving image by extension. They are decontextualized artifacts. So what it means, they're filmed or taken in one location and they're being interpreted in another. And during that interpretation, many things are possible. Sometimes we could see circulation of imagery from another event, from another geographic location. Sometimes in the area of deepfakes, we can see manufacturing and circulation of deepfakes related to the event. We can see circulation of real imagery, but in a way that's being connected to various strategic narratives that benefit various actors, state and non-state. Or we can see the circulation of real imagery where the veracity of that imagery is getting denied to delegitimize some of the claims.
All right, you've outlined a whole list of misinformation and disinformation, and I urge you, listeners, to actually, look at the difference between the two. What should tech companies do now, then, to prevent the spreading of dangerous propaganda? And how should social media users, people like you and I, help as well?
So it is not an easy task, right? The difference between misinformation and disinformation is essentially the purpose. So misinformation might be an unintentional use of a different image. Maybe somebody hadn't checked it. Maybe somebody just was in a hurry to post something, and that is why that appeared. Unfortunately, misinformation does delegitimize some of the pretty legitimate claims that may want to be made by eyewitnesses or by people who interpret those events. So it is unfortunate, but it's not always done on purpose. Whereas disinformation is always strategic. It is always perpetrated by those agents that aim to purport some influence on those platforms. Unfortunately, research shows that fact-checking is not always an effective way of combating disinformation. Unfortunately, a lot of the times users do not really care whether an information is factually correct. What they do care about is by means of sharing that information, they are conveying and articulating a kind of a sense of identity. And that is what is being exacerbated right now. Is there is a lot of polarization that we're seeing on social media in order to exacerbate some of the existing tensions between users, between the publics. And that is, of course, that acts to the benefit of such actors as Russia, such actors as Iran. And so that is what we're observing now.
All right, believe it or not, people sometimes forward videos just because they think they're being kind or generous, Dr. Boychuk. Well, traditionally, both misinformation and disinformation come into play during wartime. In this case, disinformation. We heard this morning Israel warning parents to remove TikTok and Instagram from their kids' phones for fear of Hamas posting hostage videos. Can you talk to us about the purpose, the effect, and the impact of tactics like this?
It is indeed an issue of tremendous concern. There are some platforms on which this content is being algorithmically moderated. It is not always, again, it's not an easy task. And a lot of the times we have some historical examples where actually some of these atrocities had to be seen by the public in order for the public to realize the extent and the scale of what happened. So it is not always in favor of the public. It's not always in the public interest to just remove that violent content because the public has a civic responsibility to know. And so that is one aspect. Another aspect is that some kinds of content is much harder to moderate. For example, on TikTok, it is really difficult to moderate those videos because they need to be kind of taken frame by frame. And sometimes it's just hard to understand what they're really showing. We have seen some attempts to even fool the algorithm, right? Sometimes some people who are eyewitnessing, for example, war crimes, they understand that some of their content might be removed by the platform. And so they find creative ways to circumvent that censorship, to circumvent that content moderation. They might try to purport as if the video or a post is showing something else. We've seen a lot of selfies with a description of some of the graphic events that might have happened to the person. And so, yes, it is really difficult to moderate. Sometimes it is worth seeing. But of course, increasingly on platforms such as TikTok, we see a lot of war footage. And so that footage is being used by open source intelligence communities to actually understand what's happening. Increasingly, and this is unprecedented in history, where some of that footage on social media is being used to prosecute war crimes. And so again, by removing some of that footage, social media companies are responsible for effectively making it much harder to investigate some of those crimes against humanity, kind of like we saw in Israel. We can see in Israel, this was particularly during the terrorist attack of Hamas, we saw some of the eyewitnesses live streaming their experiences kind of from the ground. And so that kind of footage is incredibly distressing. But again, just to speak in that we need some of the footage needs to be seen, but of course not by young children. A lot of the times, except for, well, in addition to eyewitness testimony, we can see that footage being shared and interpreted to change some of the public attitudes and behaviors with regard to the event. It can be used to mobilize publics to take certain action, but sometimes it's used to prevent the publics from taking certain actions. Sometimes it might be used to incite incivility, incite hatred, polarize the publics along certain lines. And that is really dangerous because some of those existing frictions might be used by nefarious actors to weaken, reduce the quality of public discourse and really to weaken to undermine the legitimacy of some of the actors involved.
So, Dr. Boychuk, good and bad, very quickly, I've got one last question for you. Who is to oversee this situation in this modern era? It sounds terribly complicated. The EU's, trying to take Elon Musk's X to task, but he's keeping quiet. That's just one region.
Absolutely. That's just one region, but the EU is an absolute pioneer in trying to enforce some of these safeguards. We know that the EU with the GDPR was really a historical act of trying to protect the user's privacy, of trying to protect the user's data. And so indeed, it is really difficult to regulate social media platforms because they resist being defined as media institutions. And because of that, they are not the laws that regulate the media, they are not able to regulate platforms. We saw the Cambridge Analytica scandal that Meta was involved in a few years ago, and now Elon Musk is also under public scrutiny. And the outcome of what happens in this context might really determine how we treat and how we regulate social media platforms going forward. And that will have increasingly important implications on our understanding of wars, and on our ability to perhaps participate in some of the discourse around them, but also on the ability of the nefarious actors to manipulate some of the discourse surrounding those events.
So potentially landmark what's to come in the next couple of days. Thank you very much for speaking with us. Dr. Olga Boychuk speaking with us live from Sydney, Australia.